Hi, I'm Yumna Patel, Palestine News Director at Mondawais. I sat down with Palestinian lawyer and analyst Diana Buttu to speak about the role social media is playing right now in the genocide in Gaza and how many of us feel like we're being gaslit by our politicians and world leaders on a daily basis. In this conversation, we speak about everything from the Israeli propaganda machine and the detrimental role that the Israeli army's own soldiers may be playing in that, and of course, what it means for Palestinians that their genocide is being played live on screens around the world. Take a listen. To start off, I wanted to ask you sort of what your experience has been in that regard as you've been, you're in Palestine, you are in 48, so you are experiencing this occupation and apartheid in a way that's very different to Gaza, but it still is this collective experience that Palestinians have been going through. So what has this been like? And I know this is a big question. What has this been like for you to be witnessing this genocide happening, obviously witnessing the changes happening around you where you live in real time, but also witnessing these atrocities from your telephone or from your television screen?
Yumna, where do I begin? One of the most difficult things is being 150 kilometers away from Gaza, and knowing what Israel's doing 150 kilometers away, and yet living in a society that is openly cheering this on, and then suppressing any attempts to bring forward any voices or any criticism of what Israel is doing. And and I know that you know this, but I've had I've had the privilege of living in Gaza. I lived there for a year and a half in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, and so I have many, many, many friends there. And I'm not the only one who has friends there. Every Palestinian I know has either friends or family living in Gaza. And even if they don't, our hearts are there. And so when you're living in 48, as I'm living, you live in a space where you're surrounded by people who are cheering on the genocide, who are openly advocating for genocide, and at the same time repressing any attempts to talk about what Israel's doing. So, for example, Israel has barred any and all protests against this war, with the exception of protests that are carried out in Tel Aviv by the Jewish Israeli community. um, Palestinians in 48 have been arrested for things like Facebook posts or even liking a picture on Instagram. We've seen that hundreds of students have been disciplined, not for anything that they did on campus, but again, for social media posts, for even liking a social media post, with these universities even going so far as to then send these complaints to the police themselves. And one of the things that's the most disturbing about this is that this isn't just the state apparatus that's going after Palestinians. It's it's your neighbor, it's your colleague, it's the person you're at study group with, and you just see that this whole machinery of of supporting genocide is against you. You know, for example, in Haifa, where I live, there are now militias that you see openly roaming the streets, carrying weapons, and they go through your social media posts, and people place you on a list. I know that I personally have been placed on a list. I know that I personally have been subjected to complaints to the Israeli police for interviews that I've given. And I'm not alone. We've seen the arrest of people like Dalal Abu Amni for a Facebook post that says, "There is no protector but God," or the arrest of Maysa Abdel Hadi for liking an Instagram post, which she then later removed. So it's to live here is to live in a society that is openly supporting, in some cases, advocating genocide and feeling that you are next. But it doesn't just stop there. You then look down at your phone and you see the level of dehumanization that Palestinians go through on a daily basis. Again, not just from the Israelis, but globally. Everything from the way that this genocide is being covered, everything from whether they label it a genocide, whether they listen to what Israeli leaders are saying when they openly advocate ethnic cleansing and genocide, whether they are wholeheartedly going along with the bombing of hospitals and schools and the measures that Israel's taking to bomb not only the north but the south, and somehow framing this as phases to a war. So being a Palestinian here is to be living in the belly of the beast, to be surrounded by people who are supporting and advocating genocide, and yet knowing that 150 kilometers away, Israel's carrying out a genocide, and we just might be next.
I think you hit on this experience that I have, witnessed from my Palestinian friends, and something that everyone has been experiencing, of living in, as you described it, the belly of the beast, whether it be in 48 or in Ramallah or Bethlehem in the West Bank, or of course, in Jerusalem or Gaza. Everyone is experiencing different degrees and levels, right, of Israel's occupation and apartheid and Israeli violence, from the settlers, as you mentioned, from your neighbors, maybe wherever, if you're living in 48, or from like the soldiers and the state itself. And as you're experiencing that, you mentioned you're also looking at your phone screen and seeing the entire world, or the political establishment in the US, for example, which is funding this genocide. You're seeing the active denial of your experience that, like, you are currently going through. And I mean, for me, as I would describe someone from the outside looking in, someone, who cares about Palestine, and it's incredibly like, not just frustrating, doesn't even begin to describe sort of that feeling of like witnessing, experiencing, um, being a part of this reality, and then having people deny it. So I can't imagine what that's experience like is like for you and for other Palestinians.
You know, to live in Palestine or to be Palestinian is to live with this constant sense of Nakba denial or Nakba apology,
Hmm.
right? And especially in when you live here in 48, Israelis are either Nakba deniers or they're Nakba apologists. There's very few who who condemn the Nakba and who are actively trying to advocate for the right of return. The numbers are few. And so you have to fast forward that 75 years. And what we're living today is the Nakba 2.0, which is exactly what Israeli politicians are calling it, is Nakba 2.0. So it's the same. It's either genocide apologists or genocide deniers, and or even worse, the open open supporters of it. And there's few here who are stepping back and saying, this is genocide, we have to stop. So it's the feeling of constantly being gaslit. Like, well, I can give you an example. At one point in time, the Israelis came out and said something like, we can't be certain of the number of people who've been killed in Gaza because these are numbers that are being counted by the people in Gaza. Well, you only believe that if you are actively dehumanizing people. Of course, the numbers are going to be counted by the people in Gaza. Who else are they going to be counted? Exactly, who else are they going to be counted by? But then the amazing thing is that from that one statement, instead of their reaction being instead of the US reaction, for example, being the reaction that you and I just had, which is, of course, they're going to be counted by the people in Gaza. Where else are they going to be counted? Or by whom else are they going to be counted? The response was, yeah, we can't believe those numbers. And so then Palestinians then have to further dehumanize themselves by issuing a 212-page document with the names, the ages, and the ID numbers of all of the, at that point in time, 7,067 Palestinians that had been killed up until that date. And even despite issuing this document with all 7,067 names, that 212 pages up until that point, you still had people who were also questioning and still question the numbers. And so it
Mhm.
leads you to believe, well, what did you think was going to happen when on a weekly basis, Israel's dropping 6,000 bombs on a place that is 365 square kilometers? Of course, there's going to be close to 30,000 people killed. Of course, there's going to be in the thousands of people who are still trapped in rubble. Of course, there's going to be in the tens, if not higher, thousands of people who've been injured. Of course it is, but we're still trapped in this cycle where because Palestinians have been so dehumanized that you're still even having to prove that you've been killed. You have to prove that the people who've been injured have been injured. You have to prove that Israel has flattened Gaza, even though they've said that they're flattening Gaza. It's
Right.
like you're always in a place where you have to prove everything that Israel has said that it's going to do and is doing.
Yeah. And I think this experience that you're talking about of like Palestinians having to, the way you put it, further dehumanize themselves by trying to just prove that we are in fact being killed, we are in fact being exterminated. I think is an experience truly, at least in this point of time, unique to Palestinians. And you know, in my experience studying Palestine, living in Palestine, reporting about Palestine, and also, being a journalist and having studied media, I'd always thought, and still to a degree, um, with the emergence of social media, really felt like, okay, social media in all of its, levels, and I had always felt that social media could and does offer a space for a different narrative, right? So, with the existence of social media, Palestinians in this case do not have to rely anymore on, you know, mainstream media outlets and networks like CNN, for example, to be telling their own story or telling the world what is happening to Palestinians. So you think, right? Okay, with social media, Palestinians are telling their own stories. That means people will believe them. And we're actually seeing that, at least, and I think, and I want to talk about this more. I think social media really has changed things in the sense that a lot of people really are witnessing for the first time with their own eyes around the world what is happening to the Palestinians. But at the same time, we're seeing this extreme reaction to that, um, of everyone is witnessing what's happening, but there's this extra level of gaslighting with that, of like, no, actually, this is not happening to Palestinians. Actually, there's a genocide. Hamas is trying to commit a genocide against the Jewish people, and Jewish people around the world are experiencing a genocide. Or, the real threat right now is on campuses, for example, right? And anti Semitism on campuses. So there's this extreme gaslighting of Palestinians, and then also like deflection, right, to other issues, be it manufactured, or exaggerated to essentially like detract from Palestinian experiences. And that has been one of the most kind of mind-boggling experiences is to like see that play out and see politicians and congressional hearings and the media talking about, the dangers of anti-Semitism on U.S. campuses and how chants are calling for the genocide of the Jewish people when in reality there is an active genocide happening.
Yes, yeah. Look, there's a few things to say about social media. First, social media does remove that gatekeeping, right? It removes those barriers. You don't have that barrier to access that was once there. But social media is also a series of silos, and you follow those accounts that you want to follow, and you don't follow those accounts that you don't want to follow. So there's certainly a lot of activity on social media, and we do see that despite the billions, and it is in the billions, that Israel has invested in PR campaigns, in trying to influence in social media, the numbers are definitely not in their favor because they have a bad product. Let's be clear. So all of that, and of course, there's ways that they can put pressure to have people shadow banned and to change algorithms and to have it such that people's accounts get taken down. I mean, we've seen all of this, but at the same time, despite all of that, we've seen that there have been some real breakthroughs, and that people are becoming much more aware of what's happening in Palestine. So these issues that are manufactured are precisely that, manufactured. And as much as they're manufactured, I think because people are seeing the images that we're seeing, that and they're small, right? Like they're, because of all the shadow bans and all these other things, we're not seeing the full extent of it. And of course, because we don't live in Gaza, we are not seeing the full extent of it either. But despite all of that, we're seeing that people aren't believing the manufactured stuff. And so for me in particular, it feels so odd to be sitting in a place where it's a genocide is being, massacre after massacre is being perpetrated every day. Genocide is being carried out every day. The Israelis have been clear about the ethnic cleansing process of Gaza. They've been clear. Every level of government has been clear. And yet you see that rather than Israelis focusing on what they are doing, they're instead focused on creating a totally different reality in a totally different country, and perpetuating this narrative that is designed to deflect from what they're doing, and they are deflecting from what they're doing. They aren't paying attention. Being here is such an exercise in, I don't even know the word. It's like living in a parallel universe. You turn on the news and you hear about Israeli soldiers killed. It then pivots to a person who rallies up Israelis to say we have to hit Palestinians more. There should be 100,000 killed. There shouldn't be a single Gazan left. I mean, this is on the news daily, by the way. To then pivoting to how persecuted Israel is, and you the whole time, what's missing in all of this is what is it that Israel is actually doing in Gaza? And the whole point, and the reason that they're not covering this is because they want to deflect. They don't want people to see. And I can't, I'm not going to cut them slack and say they don't know. Of course they know what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
You can't look at numbers and say, you have every ability to check any news outlet around the world and see the numbers of Palestinians who've been killed. You can't look at that and say, oh, but the way in which that Israel is operating is to forever put itself in the role of the victim, even though it's the perpetrator of a genocide.
Yeah.
And that's the part that's so hard to wrap your head around.
And the last point that you made is that Israel has always, throughout history, positioned itself as um, this victim that is constantly under attack, right? And is constantly in need to defend itself from its hostile neighbors. And that's the narrative that's been pushed for decades, right? Around the world.
But the question is, why do they have hostile neighbors?
Right.
Right? And that's the question that they never ask is why
Yeah.
is it that that our neighbors are so, as they put it, hostile? They're quote unquote hostile for a reason because you took somebody else's country and you kicked them out. And so this is the part that Israel's always attempting to decontextualize what it has done. It attempts to turn Palestinians into somehow irrational actors. It completely tries to turn Palestinians into not only irrational actors, but this threat that they must eradicate. When the whole point is that Palestinians are actually very rational. Anybody who is facing the ethnic cleansing from their home is going to push back. Anybody whose house is being taken over is going to push back. Of course they are. Nobody
Mhm.
wants to be removed from their home. Nobody wants to feel unsafe in their home and in their homeland. And that's the part that Israel isn't willing to understand. They want history to end somehow with for Palestinians with the creation of the state of Israel, and then then history ends. There's no, and then it begins again on October 7th. This is the way
Right.
that Israel has always positioned itself. So there isn't anything that happened before 1948. And there's nothing that happened after from 1948
Mhm.
until the current day. That's the way that they want us to behave. And of course, people are seeing through it.
Yeah, exactly. I think any sort of I don't even know, like solace. There's nothing. I truly feel like nothing good. You don't feel like anything good has happened. Nothing good has come out of any of this. Of course, this mass slaughter and genocide. But the one tiny positive thing that I feel like I have seen is exactly what you just said, is maybe somewhere people are seeing through it. The people that are witnessing it, the people, whose screens this is coming across, the people who are paying attention. I mean, I'm constantly on social media, right? And I was on social media, however many years ago when I was in college too. But I've noticed such a huge difference um, in the way that people, especially young people, how their opinions are being formed right now. And Israel and the US will say, oh, young people are being brainwashed by TikTok and by social media, and, they're being fed all these lies to hate Israel, whatever. But I actually think, exactly like you said, people are just seeing through that Israeli narrative. They're seeing right through the propaganda. They're seeing right through the U.S. government, propaganda and support for Israel. Because when a young person opens up their phone, right, and they follow whoever they follow from Gaza, they see bombs being rained down, people being displaced, children being killed, people starving and freezing to death in tents in refugee camps in Gaza. And then they see Israel and the US saying, like, Israel is the victim, Israel needs to defend itself, Israel has a right to defend itself. But then they see, whatever Israeli, like official Israeli propaganda is going out there, I think, in my opinion, is being actively undermined by what Israeli soldiers themselves are actually posting on social media directly to TikTok, Instagram, Telegram, whatever it may be. Every single day there is a new video of soldiers acting so callously in Gaza, blowing up homes, mocking Palestinians, burning down their homes, doing marriage proposals, save the date announcements before they blow up a home. All of these things that are so callous and so inhumane and make such a mockery of human life. People are seeing that and saying, wait, how are, like, I don't get how we're being told that this is the victim here. Something doesn't make sense. And so that's also been something really interesting to witness, is that Israel's propaganda machine, like you said, they just don't have good product. But also, I think they're actively being undermined by their own soldiers and their own those soldiers' social media activity that people are witnessing and being like, "Hey, this is really messed up."
It's a few things. You're absolutely right. So first, it's a very bad product. And no matter what you do, you can have as many influencers to try to claim that the product is good. We've all seen through this. It's a bad product. But second, there's such a level of arrogance to these soldiers that they think that these videos are only being viewed by them, and they've dehumanized Palestinians so much that they don't even see Palestinians as humans. Like they don't even see that what they're doing is wrong. And they arrogantly believe that what they're doing is actually kind of cute. Who blows up a Palestinian house for your child's second birthday? Who
Mhm.
takes over a Palestinian house and writes a save the date to your as a wedding announcement? Unless you just fundamentally don't see Palestinians as humans. And people see through that. So they see through the bad product when they see how Israel's bombing kids, bombing hospitals, bombing schools, when you see people being pulled out of rubble, when you see the level of dignity that Palestinians have, and when you see the lack of dignity that Israelis have, and they've shown it time and again, day in and day out, they're so arrogant with their lack of dignity that soldiers actually think that what they're doing is cute, and people see past that. You remind me actually of something. Um, there's having lived here, it's a very racist society, and people are very open about their racism in ways that I've never experienced in other countries around the world that are racist. The United States is racist. But this is such an open level of racism, and actually kind of a pride in racism. And when you live here for a while, the racism becomes so normalized that people who are from the outside and come in, after a while, they take on that same level of racism, and that those the racist statements stop affecting them because it just becomes par for the course. So I've heard
Mhm.
many diplomats, journalists, others say, "Oh, but isn't that the way Israeli society is?" So rather than them questioning the racism, it's just kind of like, "Oh, they just normalize it and accept it." This is what these soldiers are doing now. Is that it's such a high level of dehumanization that it's become normal in many ways to see these videos of people blowing up a Palestinian house to celebrate their child's second birthday, to take over a Palestinian house for a save the date, to rummage through Palestinian clothes and find lingerie, God forbid, to go through their kitchens and look at what it is that Palestinians use to cook. It's become so commonplace now that Israelis don't even see it any longer.
Mhm.
That's how normal it's become. But yet, when you're on the outside, this is not normal because it isn't normal.
Yeah.
And that's the glimpse that the rest of the world is now seeing. They're
Mhm.
actually seeing what we live every day.
Yeah. Yeah. So many of the stories, like especially the last one that you mentioned, and I think a lot of us have seen these videos of Israeli soldiers going in, and rummaging through Palestinian homes. I saw a video of a soldier, some soldiers, there was a video that went viral very recently of a group of soldiers. I don't know, I guess they're in the same troop or whatever it is. And they edited this whole video together where, they were cooking in the house, they were using the kitchen, they were doing all this stuff. And then, they left. And as they left, they burned the house down.
Yeah.
Um, and I truly couldn't believe what I was seeing, the levels of just the levels of dehumanization. Um, Especially when you know that if that Palestinian family who lived in that home, if they're even still alive, that they're not that far away from where their home is. Maybe just a few kilometers away, seeking refuge in maybe a school or in a camp or somewhere. And seeing videos like that immediately in my mind harken back to the stories that we've heard about the Nakba, right? And how the Israeli soldiers, they kicked families out from their home, and in some place, in some, the settlers or the soldiers, when they got to the home, there was still food on the table, or the food was still warm. And I know
Yeah.
all over Palestine, you have, in the West Bank, you have Palestinian refugees who were kicked out of their homes in the Nakba, who are living literal kilometers away from where their village either still stands and is being occupied by settlers, where their village was destroyed to the ground. So that experience is, and you mentioned the Nakba at the beginning, that it's so clear that this is another Nakba, but this time it's being like broadcasted to us
It's
on
live.
our, it's live, it's happening live. And that is so crazy. um and what's even crazier than that is that I think there's always been this, I've heard this before, even friends have said, what if there was what if there were phones, or what if there was social media like back when the Nakba happened? Maybe would that have changed things? Or would Israel and the world not be denying our history for 75 years if there was more documentation? But we're witnessing a Nakba now live, and that denial is still happening.
You remind me of a few things. My late father was from a small town just outside of Nazareth called the Limjedel. And in 1948, i- his family, and not just his family, the entire town fled to neighboring Nazareth. Some fled even further to Lebanon, to Syria, to Jordan. My father ended up living in a house that is exactly 3 kilometers away from his original home. He was never allowed to go back to Lemjedel, um, even until his death in 2021. Um, he he used to talk to me and describe that for him it wasn't just a question of losing his house. And my grandmother used to say the same thing. It wasn't just a question of losing your house, but about losing your home. And that this because there's a difference between a house and a home, the security, the safety, but also losing, um, having Israel rob them of community, of of who they are, and forever living in a place that isn't yours, where you're yearning to go back. So and as I said, from my father, who fled when he was 9 years old and died at the age of 82, for all of those years he was never able to go back to his home, to his land. And that's what it's like to live as a Palestinian. And this is what we're witnessing today. So the decisions that I used to hear my grandmother talk about, um, when she was describing what happened to her during the Nakba, and what the Israelis did, and how they had to take the decision to flee. I understood it on a logical level before, but now in my core, I understand it. I feel it, because I know what they had to, how they were weighing things, and what they were seeing happening around them, and how for them it was a question of life or death. And in Gaza, it's the same thing. It's a question of life or death. But when I used to think the same thing. If only people saw, if only they had. But the problem is that this is the most documented place ever. There are more reports that come out about Israel's atrocities every year than on any country around the world. In some cases, tenfold of any place around the world, if not more. So it's not a question of not knowing, it's a question of not wanting to act. And that's why I think so much of what you were saying about the images that we're seeing in the social media and the fact that it's a bad product, we wouldn't be seeing these, we wouldn't be seeing people in the millions coming out week after week around the world demanding that Israel stop if they actually believed the bad product and the bad influencers. It's because they're seeing this. At the same time, I every day I see a new image and I say, this is it. This is going to be the image that's going to strike at the hearts of people. And then the next day, this is going to be the image. And here we are 90 days into Israel's attack on Gaza. And we've seen tens of thousands of images, each more gruesome than the next. And it hasn't moved the politicians, but it has moved people. It has moved people. And that's where I think the change is happening, is that we're even seeing a different tone when it comes to um, like people, the influence that people are having is actually influencing politicians in a way that I didn't expect would happen. So yes, we have not seen calls for a ceasefire by Biden. Let's be clear. But for the first time, we are hearing people talking about halting arms to Israel. For the first time, we are hearing people talking about Palestinian freedom, including on a political level. For the first time, we are hearing people talk about the illegality of occupation and the siege. And that is simply because all of these images have driven people, and people are coming out in the millions because this affects them too. This is an issue of global humanity and affects them too. So I'm not we're paying a very heavy price, but I'm not but and I don't know how to say this. We're paying a very heavy price, and I don't want to feel despair
Yeah.
because I feel that there has been such that Palestinians have shown the world such dignity, and Israel has not, and that is has really moved people. And
Mhm.
that moving of people, I ultimately believe, will change the reality for Palestinians on the ground. It really will. It really will.
And I think you just have to believe that, right? Because how else do you
You have to.
reconcile everything that's happening, these feelings of despair and hopelessness, and what you talked about is a feeling that I truly think everyone has had, is today will be the day. This image of babies left to decompose in their hospital beds, this image of I don't know, people being buried alive by every image is just, there's more horror every day, and so it's hard to feel um any sort of hope. But yeah, seeing people come out in numbers that we've never witnessed before, um seeing so many people newly brought to this issue, to this cause, sort of awakened by everything that's happening. And it does give you some some hope or some faith that hopefully the end is near, that this genocide, first and foremost, will, that the bombing will stop, that there will be a ceasefire. But then, even more than that, it doesn't just end there. Even if the bombing ends, Palestinians are still living under occupation. They're still living under apartheid and under an even more like volatile and aggressive state and settler population. Um, so the violence is still very much there. Um, but I think what we're seeing now really is, as a result of these protests and these, changes in public opinion, it's very clear that Israel is feeling very threatened. The US is feeling threatened in its support of Israel. And that's, I mean, in my opinion, and I'd be curious to hear what you think about this, is, you know, the responses that we've seen, like for example, South Africa filed that appeal with the ICJ, with the International Court of Justice, against against Israel to stop the genocide, and we had U.S. Officials saying, that is completely baseless. It has no basis in fact. And I don't know, to me, we see that we're like, okay, something's not adding up. This is the sort of gaslighting that we've been talking about, right? But I think when people see that, they don't believe anymore when the US says, no, 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 that's not true. Don't believe that. People are saying, no, we're really witnessing something happening. There's clearly a disconnect between what is actually happening and what you're trying to support. And I think that's representative of just like the desperation from Israel and its allies um, to keep it in power in the face of so much global um, support behind Palestine.
The amazing thing is that so much has become clear. Um, do you know how sometimes, like, I don't know if you've ever noticed when you're here, but the clearest days are sometimes the coldest days, right? Where there's not a single cloud in the sky and you can see everything super clearly. That's where we're at right now. The Everything has become clear. It's become clear that this is an Israeli attack, genocide on Gaza, but not just an Israeli attack on Gaza, an Israeli American attack on Gaza. It's become very clear just how the United States, as much as it may try to claim that it's an honest broker, it's become clear that it is doing Israel's bidding. We've seen it with the fact that they haven't been that they vetoed a number of UN Security Council resolutions and then abstained from the other one. And it's become clear when you look at the history of the US use of the veto that it's only ever been used in two instances. One is when it comes to Israel, first and foremost. The second is when it comes to Russia on a much smaller scale. So it's become clear that this is Israel and the US in lockstep with one another. But it's also become clear that everything that the world did up until this point has been a complete and utter failure. That the world, leave aside the US, which we know is in lockstep with Israel, but everybody else has also failed Palestinians, country wise. I'm not talking about people. And it's also become clear that there's a huge difference between the people of the world and the leadership of the world.
Mhm.
All of this has become clear. And lastly, what's become clear is this idea that there's some notion of global human rights or international human rights or an international system. There is no system. Its might is right. And people have deluded themselves over these years into thinking that somehow there is going to be countries that will rush to the defense of others to prevent genocide. There have been other examples of genocide, But this is a genocide like no other because this is being perpetrated against a defenseless civilian refugee population, refugees who've been raided refugees by Israel. And if anything, this is the time where you should be seeing the world community act and rush to come to the defense of this refugee, stateless, defenseless, by the way, child population, and instead they're not.
Yeah.
Just except for South Africa.
Yeah. We've covered so much ground in this conversation and
My
I
pleasure.
really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, to share your thoughts, to share your own personal stories. I mean, the story of your father and your family's like Nakba story. I mean, I had goosebumps listening to that. I think there's as much as we witness all the atrocities and so many people's hearts have been moved and called to action by what they're seeing in Palestine. Truly, no one can ever like fathom the experience,
Yeah,
the multi-layered, multi-generational experience that Palestinians experience every single day,
right.
um, and are experiencing now to a degree that no one, I think, not even many Palestinians could even fathom. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for speaking with us. Is there anything else that you would like to share?
No, I think that's it. I was going to share an anecdote if you'd like.
Please do. Yeah.
So yesterday, um, my friend Musab Abu Toha, the writer, he called and he said, um, "What is it that we're not doing?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, like, "What is it that we're not doing to get the world to act? Do they need to see more pictures? Do they need to read more poems? Do they need to hear more stories? You tell me, you lived in the West. What is it that we're not doing?" And his point was, it wasn't a rhetorical one. This question was not a rhetorical one at all. It was very much a question of, when is it that we're going to see change? I mean, when is it that we're going to, like, when is it that people are going to sit up and say, yes, that's enough, yes, they've sustained enough? um, and and then interspersed in that, he was telling me about his home and how the Israelis bombed his home and they bombed his library, that he worked so hard to put together. And I shared the story of my own father, and how the Israelis not only erased Elim Jedel, my father's town, but then replaced it with an Israeli town called Migdal Ha'emek, which incidentally, it's as a Palestinian, you can't buy a house there. And so I can't even buy a house on the very land that I should have, um, that we own, inherited, exactly. And he said to me, "Do you think that's going to happen to us?"
Hmm.
And what do you say?
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah.
say?
And it's not even it isn't a rhetorical question
It's
because
not
we have
rhetorical.
seen Israelis advocating for the complete flattening of Gaza in order to build settlements. And that's also something that's hasn't really been talked about a lot is, and we discussed sort of the what individual soldiers have been doing on the ground. A lot of their sort of like their mentality is surround has to do with this idea of conquering back Gaza, right, and getting back the settlements and resettling Gaza, to Gush Katif and these other settlements that were pulled out in the 2005 engagement. So that question of, is that going to happen to us, where you know an Israeli town is going to be built on top of our home and we're not even going to be able to go there? That is not a rhetorical question that is not out of the realm of, you know, possibilities, or because it's happened for 75 years. So many of Gaza are already the descendants of refugees from the Nakba. But I mean, that is literally what Israel is advocating for now,
Exactly.
to wipe
Exactly.
it out and to build settlements on top of it.
And what do you say to a person who just survived a genocide, whose family is still trapped in Gaza, who he hasn't been able to reach his brother for days? I mean, what do you say? Yes, this is what Israel is going to do.
Mm,
This is the world in which this is the reality that we're living in, where we're in a place where he's trying to seek comfort from me because I didn't have to go through that genocide. And there's no comfort I can give him because I know that my father went through a genocide in 1948
mhm.
and survived it. And you know what the Israeli plans are, and you see what the Israeli plans are, and you see the soldiers talking about, as you put it, resettling. You see the politicians talking about going back, and you hear these mealy mouthed statements from by the Americans saying that it won't happen. But I don't believe them, and I don't think anybody should believe them.
Right. You see, the State Department saying, you know, Gazans should not be displaced
Yeah,
while they're actively arming and funding Israel to drop the bombs that displace Palestinians from their homes in
exactly.
Gaza.
Exactly. Look, they're going to do just in the same way that Israelis spun the Nakba as being a voluntary flight.
Mm,
They're going to spin this Nakba as being
mm.
voluntary flight as well. Yeah,
As a humanitarian,
exactly.
it's actually humanitarian of us to move Gazans into Egypt or wherever it may be
Exactly.
to
Exactly.
save their lives.
Exactly. Exactly. Rather than, I was talking to a friend about this the other day, rather than doing what should have been done, which is just in the same way that Palestinians can flee into Gaza, how about fleeing the other direction into their homes, right? Into the places that they're from, the areas of the envelope, Jaffa, and so on. Israel's so humanitarian. Why is that not a possibility?
Right.
Letting them go home. Yeah.
Thank you, Diana.
My
Thank you so
pleasure.
much.
My
I
pleasure.
really appreciate your time, and your conversation, and your insights. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. No, thanks.